This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join ASA for only $60 Australian, and they also have a concession membership that costs a mere $15 Australian for, among others, students, the unwaged, or the precariously waged. You can follow ASA on social media, and you should be sure to take a look at their twice-yearly open access peer-reviewed journal, Animal Studies Journal. This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Recent publications in the series include Animal Welfare in China by Peter J. Lee and Animal Dreams, a collection of essays by David Brooks. And I'm excited to say that Siobhan O'Sullivan, the founding host of Knowing Animals, will be talking to Peter Lee about animal welfare in China for a future episode. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor Laura Wright. Laura is a professor of English at Western Carolina University. She's authored research monographs on the work of J.M. Coetzee and on postcolonial studies, but she's particularly well known in the animal studies world for championing vegan studies. Her book, The Vegan Studies Project, Food, Animals and Gender in the Age of Terror, was published in 2015 by the University of Georgia Press, and her edited collection, Through a Vegan Studies Lens, Textual Ethics and Lived Activism, was published in 2019 by the University of Nevada Press. Today, we're going to be talking about her paper, Framing Vegan Studies, Vegetarianism, Veganism, Animal Studies, Ecofeminism, which is the first chapter of the Routledge Handbook of Vegan Studies. The handbook, which Laura edited, was published earlier this year. Welcome to the podcast, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I realise that this is a question that potentially takes us back a number of years, but could you tell us what led you to editing the Routledge Handbook of Vegan Studies?
It's been a really interesting kind of journey, and yeah, it could go back many, many years. I'll try and condense some of that. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the works of J.M. Coetzee, a South African author whose work has dealt with animals in interesting ways, and I think I was one of the first people actually writing about him in that way at that time. So from there, I think my work as a postcolonialist really started to lean in the direction of looking at the environment in postcolonial literature. And I'm a South African literature specialist primarily, but I also look at works from Nigeria, India, the Pacific Rim, the Caribbean. So I'm kind of, all over the globe, basically, and looking at environmental issues and looking at animals in those works, because that work hadn't been done in the same way that I think people have been looking at animals in Western texts for longer. And from there, I decided to become vegan myself in about 2001. I'd been vegetarian since 1988. So I took on this identity for lots of complicated reasons. And over the course, I guess, of the next decade, I got a job. I graduated out of my program. I worked several jobs, actually, before I ended up where I am now in North Carolina. And I just sort of paid a lot of attention to the way that veganism was represented in the Western press, and particularly in the press in the United States. And I think the thing that really did it for me was an editorial in the Chronicle of Higher Education by Harold Fromm, who's a very well-known eco-critic, that was just this sort of bashing of vegans. And I think that was sort of the start where I was like, okay, I want to look at why. I'm really interested in the perceptions of veganism, where they come from, how they've been shaped over the past few decades, specifically by the time I got up to the Vegan Studies Project. And when the Vegan Studies Project came out, I think it just was a bit of the I don't know, academic cultural zeitgeist that it kind of it fit into in a way that nothing I've ever written before has done. And people were interested in it. And it got a lot of attention or a lot more attention than anything else I've ever done. And so from that, I have had opportunities to publish other works. And Routledge actually approached me last year, I believe, or maybe a year before last, and asked if I wanted to edit a handbook on vegan studies. And I thought, well, this is interesting that, this field that I kind of named, I'm now being asked to sort of define it in this way.
Well, it was actually this question of defining vegan studies that I wanted to ask about first. So, bearing in mind that we are primarily an animal studies podcast, could you tell us what vegan studies is and what its relationship is with animal studies?
It sort of emerged as a bit of I don't want to say it wasn't a joke. I was trying to think about veganism as a lens through which to view the world, a theoretical lens. I know that veganism is, of course, something that is considered in animal studies as well, but I think I wanted to pull it out and think more specifically about what it meant to be vegan, to be a vegan scholar, to live in the world where you are in a lot of ways, particularly if you're one of these people like me who's not trying to walk around announcing that you're vegan, sort of feeling like you're a bit of an alien in a culture where everything is dependent on consumerism and on basically the bodies of animals. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily a way of disaggregating what I think vegan studies is from animal studies more broadly. But in defining it, I kept thinking about the ecofeminist background that I have and sort of the ways that I think ecofeminism has gotten kind of squashed within the academy for a lot of complicated reasons. I think I just was trying to look specifically at veganism and, the ways that vegans feel about animals, the choices that vegans make about animals. And I think in a lot of ways, and this is definitely not a diss on anyone doing animal studies differently, but that I think there are lots of animal studies scholars out there who aren't vegan or who theorize about animals and humans and their relationships without being vegan. And so I felt like there was sort of a subset of us in the world doing that work differently. And I wanted to look at what that might mean.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in your chapter this big controversy in animal studies, and it's one that comes up on the podcast. That's the question of whether, to quote Tracy Kenton, every animal studies scholar must be a vegan. So let me put a similar question to you. Do you think that every vegan studies scholar should be a vegan?
I do. I think that's sort of been my experience with people who are doing this, is that it is a big part of their identity, which is why, they're sort of drawn to looking at works through this particular lens. I feel like I'm going to step into something here, but I guess my experience thus far of the people who I have worked with in the field have been vegan for the most part. I imagine it would be kind of difficult to have the sort of empathetic, emotional response, empathetic imagination, I suppose, to examine works in a way that one does if one is vegan for ethical reasons.
Why do you think that we need a vegan studies if we have animal studies? Is it just the fact that there are lots of people in animal studies who aren't considering things from this vegan lens?
I think so. And like I said, it sort of started with, for me, it started with a question. Why are vegans perceived the way that they are? And also specifically, why is veganism, particularly when it is practiced by women, often equated with disordered eating? This was something that was really very personal to me, and I was seeing a lot of research out there in the world. So when I named the book the Vegan Studies Project, the first original title was going to be the Vegan Body Project. As I was kind of getting into it, I realized that I was turning it into more than that. It was doing things other than looking at vegan bodies specifically. So the name in some sense was kind of, and I talk about this in the introduction to the Vegan Studies Project, that was kind of done in the sense of play, playing around with the idea of what a theoretical vegan lens would look like. So I don't know. I guess I feel like other people have decided that we need it. And it's not like people hadn't been doing this work without there being sort of a name for it. I feel like my book just kind of came out and then suddenly it had sort of a name. There was a name for what people were doing. And I guess enough people have felt that what they're doing is distinguished enough from animal studies per se that that's the way they want to frame their work. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And what strikes me is that it sounds like there are at least two parts to vegan studies. And if you like, one is looking into veganism and one is looking out. One is about perceptions of veganism from the outside, and the other is about looking at the world or looking at culture or looking at cultural artifacts through vegan eyes.
Yeah, I think that is a great way to think about it, and I'm glad you said that because I think that gives me a kind of way of explaining it that I haven't quite been able to get my head around. Outward looking and inward looking, definitely.
Now, this might sound like an odd question, and I'll explain why I'm asking it in a second, but what is veganism? And the reason I ask is that in your chapter, you discuss a rather surprising framing of veganism as not a choice, not an ethical imperative, but as an orientation, almost like a sexual orientation.
hmm Yeah, and I was drawing on someone else's work for that. I thought it was an interesting, and I also get potentially problematic way of thinking about this behavior. Although, I will say for someone like me, if I had to say I was oriented toward anything, it would be veganism. Probably my whole life, I was entirely aware of animals and their alterity and my shared existence with him and where meat came from a very, very early age, and was incredibly troubled by it, even as a very young child. So, this idea of orientation I thought was kind of an interesting one. And I explored it in the book, also trying not to undermine other orientations like sexual orientation, which, I don't really want to say that the two are the same in any real way. But I think, the other thing about veganism in terms of how you define it, it's a very slippery term. And I've noticed, people sort of trending toward plant-based because veganism has a lot of negative associations with it. It has a lot of gender specific associations with it. Are you vegan if you wear leather but don't eat animals? Are you aspirationally vegan as I think the vegan society definition, that insofar as practical and possible, one avoids eating animal products and wearing clothing or participating in anything where animals are utilized for their bodies. Another thing in looking at disordered eating, which I've done a lot of, the people who are studying eating disorders continually get veganism wrong or get vegetarianism wrong. They're like talking about people who don't eat meat except occasionally, or it's just very strange. It's like they're using the language, but the actual practices of the people they're studying are not consistent with that language. And so I think that there are a lot of complexities around what veganism is.
Do you think that this conceptual slipperiness is a good thing, or is it a bad thing, or is it a mixed thing?
I think it's a mixed thing. I think it can be a bad thing because as I mentioned, Harold Fromm's essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education, his whole focus was that, vegans are on this quest for a purity that they can't actually attain. And the only way to attain the extreme level of non-harm that they aspire to is simply not to exist at all. And so I think, then you get into that. You get into that. Like there's no way to do there's no way to do it fully, so why bother to do it at all? But, at the same time, I feel like the term is out there being troubled enough that it must be provoking conversations that are worth having. And again, this sort of shift from vegan to plant-based, which I see predominantly among men who are writing about, plant-based diets, and the Game Changers, the film that came out that never mentions veganism, and, it's plant-based, 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 as opposed to vegan. I do worry that anytime anything is predominantly associated with women, and I think veganism is much more associated with women than men, then it runs the risk of being erased or rebranded or recodified. So I think it's both good and bad.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the Routledge Handbook of Vegan Studies more broadly? I mean, you cover a lot of ground in this book, and there's a lot of disciplinary backgrounds. So, how did you come to the list of chapters that were included?
Well, it was really interesting because, when it was first pitched to me, I thought, I don't actually know what that would look like. And then I thought, well, why not just do the same thing I've done sort of as a literary pop cultural scholar by looking at the way that veganism is contextualized and perceived throughout all kinds of disciplines, not just the ones that I'm the most comfortable with. And so, I just started thinking about what those would be. So, religion, where does veganism show up? What are the controversies within various religious practices around veganism? Then, of course, literary theoretical perspectives. Tried to look at some of the key, names in animal studies who have been instrumental in theorizing veganism and theorizing about animals. I'm trying to think what else. The book just came out and I'm like already it's such a huge project. And I feel like so exhausted and so relieved that it's out. And I'm sitting here trying to remember what all else is in it. I know that, the law, there's a section on legal practices and veganism, particularly in the United States. Veganism in China, that the person who wrote the essay on China was very interesting because she was writing it right at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. And she was in China and really engaged with the pandemic from this vegan perspective and China's history with regard to its treatment of animals and foodways. And I thought it was just this fascinating piece. And so a lot of this work was sort of coming out during the pandemic too, which I think has been another interesting lens for considering animals, considering what we eat and how we eat.
You mentioned how you're coming from the background as a literature or pop culture scholar. And, if we had longer, I'd love to talk to you about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example, which I know is something you look at in the first book.
Yes.
But I noticed from the contents page of the Routledge Handbook that there is quite a lot of analysis of literature. So there's discussion of Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, Han Kang's The Vegetarian, Miguel de Cervantes' Dialogue of the Dogs, which is not actually one I'd heard of before, I confess. Given that that's your scholarly background, and given that that's something that's covered quite a lot in this text, do you think that literature is the natural home for vegan studies? Or do you think that that's something that will change?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that since I'm the person who sort of did the thing, so to speak, I was focusing on literature and film specifically in my analyses. And so to me, of course, analyzing literature is just the most natural thing in the world. It is what I do every day, all the time. And so I'm very good at making connections in ways that, would allow me to sort of see these things. I do feel like one of the things about literature that is important to a field like vegan studies is literature's ability to actually generate empathy in people who read it. And this is literary fiction in particular that has this sort of studied reaction that, it can increase our ability to empathize with others because we're doing it by reading about people who are fictional, but, who we come to identify with. And so, yeah, maybe in some sense there is kind of a natural affiliation or affinity between the two things. But because the handbook is huge and there's all these other things in it, I think, getting the scholars, and a lot of them were already doing this, like really thinking about the ways that veganism is present in their various disciplines. But I think a lot of them also kind of came to this project not entirely sure, what it meant, and then from there developed a kind of theoretical understanding of what looking at their specific discipline through a kind of vegan theoretical lens would entail.
Laura, every guest on Knowing Animals is asked 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I can. It was Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, and I read it in a philosophy class my freshman or sophomore year in college.
Another tick for Singer. That's quite a common answer.
Yeah, it's got to be, right?
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That would be tough. I think that I wrote an essay for a collection back in 2006 on Coetzee's work, and it was called In Defense of Elizabeth Costello, and it was a feminist vegetarian defense of this character that Jane Coetzee has created as kind of an alter ego, this woman who is a vegetarian, and she sort of stands in for him in lots of different theoretical ways. And she gets this really bad rap because she's crotchety and old and unwilling to bend. And I wrote that piece, and I remember when I did it, my dissertation director at the time, it came out in 2006. I was working on it when I was still in graduate school, and he was like, "What are you doing? You're going to get made fun of so seriously for this." And I remember being like really offended. So I think that's it. And I love that piece. I think it's great.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, that one's very easy. That's Carol Adams, which I'm sure you probably get that answer a lot as well. I read The Sexual Politics of Meat, the book that came out in 1990. I didn't read it until some time later, and it profoundly influenced everything that I have done ever since. And I have worked very closely with Carol. She wrote the introduction to the Vegan Studies Project, and she's been a huge source of support and friendship to me over the years. So, yes, definitely her.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Maybe not just write about them, but actually, live in such a way that you're helping them. And I think Greta Gard, who's another person who's had kind of a profound influence on my work and life, had a piece at some point that was looking at whether or not animal studies has actually been good for animals. And her answer is that it really hasn't been. So I think, being an academic and doing the things that we do, I love the things that we do, but I also feel like being out in the world and living and doing activism that is not simply written activism in the service of animals is something that we could all do.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
So this is the one I've been looking at this question, trying to figure out how on earth to answer it just with one thing. I feel like if there was any way that I could make human beings empathetic to the suffering of non-human beings, that would be the best thing that I could do. But of course, I want human beings to be empathetic to the suffering of human beings who aren't exactly like them as well. If I could change one thing, I would make people more empathetic, just kind of universally.
What are you working on next?
Oh gosh, I'm actually working with Amelia Quinn on another collection. This one's on vegan literary studies from the University of Edinburgh. And I'm trying to write a monograph that I started. I was on leave on sabbatical in the spring of, when was it? Last year, right when everything kind of fell apart, and I was working on this book, a piece of creative nonfiction, which is something I've never done before. I made it until about March and then just stopped because of the pandemic and circumstances. So I really want to get back to that if I can. At this point, it feels almost like something that I may have to just let go of because I was writing it in such strange times that I'm not sure I can go back and get it again. But there's always something out there to work on.
Is that one vegan themed as well?
No, actually, it's called The Afterlives of Pippi Longstocking, and it is about Astrid Lindgren, who wrote Pippi Longstocking, about my father's aunt, a woman named Nora, and about me. It was supposed to be a braided narrative that sort of wove together these three intersecting stories, but I'm not sure how well I've done any of that. But it's been quite interesting to try and write.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I had a Twitter account until I got kicked off of Twitter. That's a long story. I am on Facebook. I have an academia.edu page, which pretty much has everything that I've ever published or every talk I've ever given up there. And that's sort of my clearinghouse for all of my things. And I'm also available at my email address, lwright@email.wcu.edu.
Well, thanks, Laura, for joining us for this episode of Knowing Animals.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at @aveganphilosopher. And I am quite struck, given the conversation we've just had, that I choose to identify as a vegan philosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.